Hello there, welcome. Here we are doing this. A thinking, a digital one. Welcome if you're a regular to the Tortoise newsroom. Welcome, in fact, if you're one of my colleagues at Tortoise, who for weeks now, since March the 11th, I think was the last date that we were in the office, have been trying to make the news work and do a different kind of news and operate a different kind of newsroom, all from our homes. I'm going to say this, although I hope that most people who are coming here know this by now. A Thinking is the forum of our journalism. It's the place we try and share stories and ideas. It's based on a classic news meeting. Please tell us what you think, weigh in on the chat, hit the participants tab and raise your hand to get my attention and make sure that we hear from you. This Tuesday Thinking, if you can cast your minds back, is actually born of our weekly open meeting. We started to realise after a few months in Tortoise that there wasn't a moment where the whole office got together and debated some of the issues. We were leaving sort of stories on the floor, things that people had heard about that we should be following up. We weren't examining the way in which we as a newsroom were behaving. And I tell you all of that right at the start of this one because this week's Tortoise File, as you know, we do one big subject, one big story a week, and it's a Tortoise File. This week, we've actually looked at the media itself. Most of the time, I take the view that the media, the news media in particular, is not the story. But clearly, in the case of a pandemic, when information is so critical, the way in which and the quality, the way in which we get our information, the quality of it, the questions that get asked and the way those are answered are absolutely key. So I'm going to talk a little bit, or we're going to discuss a little bit, how we're approaching the news media ourselves this week, but would be really interested to hear people's thoughts too on what they think of the news coverage of the journalism they're getting. We're also going to try something new out today, which is between myself, several editors, and Basha Cummings in particular, we've been developing what we think of as the Tortoise News List. Now, heaven knows there are enough lists in the world, but the Tortoise News List is really our way of saying, okay, what are the stories that we think are coming? What are the stories that are currently being undercovered or entirely unreported? So classically in a newsroom, when I was at the BBC or the Times or the FT, the news list would be the stories of the day. And a good top half, sometimes, you know, 3/4, if not all of it, would be events that you knew were in the diary. The Tortoise News List, if you like, is about what's actually coming, what we can see just tipping over the horizon and that we think we should be looking at. So we're going to talk about that a bit today, but as ever, most importantly, we're going to try and hear from you on what you think are the subjects and stories that we're missing. So please don't hold back, weigh in, let me know what you think we should be looking at, what we should be covering. I'm going to start, if I might, just by flagging up the work that we've done this week on the news media and what we're looking at next week. So obviously, you know, you tremble a little when you start doing stories about people who write stories or broadcast stories. There is a kind of slightly worrying trend that we in the media have to be dogs sniffing each other's rear ends on this. So the attempt was to try and make a serious look at what's structurally changing and what's in play for the media at a moment when the way in which the information we get matters most. So if you saw, Matt D'Ancona wrote yesterday about the BBC, we started on a point that was actually warmer than you might have expected. The BBC is clearly having a huge revival in its fortunes, a colossal change in its relationship with politics and government, obviously, but also in the nature of the public square. The BBC as an educator, the BBC as a place that brings people together, the BBC in the four nations of the UK and in the World Service too. And Matt's here, I'm going to come to him in a moment, just to talk a little bit about how the story played, the process of pulling it together, what he felt he learned, and also a little bit of kind of what the follow-on has been as that result of that. Then today, Jane Martinson, who did that amazing investigative piece for us on the Barclay brothers and the trials and tribulations of that family, the owners of the Daily Telegraph, has looked at the really considerable problems that are happening in the local news media in particular. So she's looked at newspapers in particular, suggested that there will be a few left standing as a result of this, but the real crisis being in local and regional newspapers and the current furloughing of thousands of journalists and the question of whether they do come back to work. And then equally, Jeff Jarvis, who's one of the great writers and thinkers on media in the US, has done the same on the print media in the US. And if you look at Jeff's piece, it's about not just the regional and local pressures on the media. It's about the fact that you've also got a very specific situation in the US where local papers, other than basically the Washington Post and the New York Times, have largely been bought up by private equity, which means they go into this with a significant amount of debt. And then in the course of the rest of the week, we're actually going to hone in specifically on the relationship between the press and the pandemic. So specifically, politics and the political briefings, the way in which the Westminster lobby works, the strategic comms that have come out from Downing Street and whether or not they are communicating effectively or well, and if you like, the new journalism, not the social media, it's well covered, but the new journalism that is that's around, particularly in different platforms on social media, and Claudia Williams and Pete Hoskin have been working on that. So I want to do just sort of 10 minutes on that, and I'd really love to hear what people think about the quality of the coverage they're getting, the questions that they think are being answered but not. I'll come to you, Keith, in a moment on the question of organised crime. I think it's a really good question. Funnily enough, Kerry, I might bring you in, Kerry, on the sort of idea of beginning to think about justice and how the justice system works. But Matt, why don't you start and just talk through sort of how you feel it was trying to report the BBC remotely in this, and where you think you came out.
Well, thanks, James. It was and hello, everyone. It was a very interesting project because when we first discussed it, it was in a very, obviously, a radically different environment. And it was around the sort of immediate aftermath of the election, if you can remember back that far, when it was clear that Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings were serious about their attacks on the BBC. This was not just the normal Conservative Party tribal grumbling about the BBC. They were genuinely looking at a new funding model, subscription model probably, and this caused great alarm, and rightly so, in the BBC, because they were not sure what they could do to counter this, and it all came to a head in February, when it looked like the BBC was about to be biffed very hard with a new look at its funding model. And then suddenly, as the piece explains, there was a kind of retreat by the government as it found that the practicalities of doing that were actually much more complicated. So the first part of it was that the BBC had earned a reprieve. And then suddenly, totally unexpectedly, the lockdown happened, and the BBC discovered that it had a new role, or you might argue a repurposing of its traditional role to be the nation's bulletin board and offer exercise classes and a much more focused news package and cultural curated culture. And this has been fantastically successful. And the numbers on iPlayer and so on and news bulletins are very, very high. But that's not the end of the story, because this is a reprieve, not a pardon. And clearly looking forward into the post-lockdown era, the BBC faces all sorts of questions. It's got all kinds of competitors, Netflix, Apple Plus, Disney, Amazon Prime and so on. But also there are questions around its coverage. One point we talked about and is dealt with in the piece is, why is the BBC better at dealing with things like health policy and not as good at dealing with the questions of business, which are going to be so central to the hellscape into which the economy is now going to emerge when we emerge from lockdown. So it's a good news story for the BBC, but it's one with qualifications. I mean, the next Director General, when Tony Hall finally does leave, which will probably be a bit later than he originally planned, the next Director General will have to really be on the front foot with these things, because the BBC is and will always be, and increasingly so, on probation, I think.
Matt, thank you. What are the sort of vulnerabilities of the BBC now? Because it's often these moments, aren't there, when actually people are thinking, okay, it's recovered its public purpose, yeah. It's restored its sort of status in the minds of politicians, but also the hearts of the public. When you sort of say, okay, take the next 6 to 18 months, what are the things that if you were the BBC you'd be looking out for?
Well, I think the point you made at the start is the key one, which is that there's a kind of like the Conservative Party, the BBC oscillates between complacency and panic, and and I think it's now feeling terribly pleased with itself, and of course that's the worst possible lesson to draw from the crisis. What it's been given is a stay. So I think there's questions of what it covers, what it focuses on, the lessons of the lockdown, that if it sticks to its core mission, it does very well. But there's also the broader economic environment. I mean, whatever funding model now takes the place of the licence fee, because I think the old-fashioned licence fee is coming to an end. The BBC has to bear in mind that these are going to be very straitened times, and people are not going to look kindly on a model that is compulsory, as it has to be in public service broadcasting, which they feel squeezes them. So the negotiation of the new licence fee, and then 5 years down the line, 2027, the new charter, is going to be a very delicate business. And I do think that means talking to all parts of the country, and being very mindful of the fact that the BBC, I don't agree totally with the caricature of the BBC as a kind of metropolitan conspiracy. I think that's wrong. But it has to be ever mindful of the fact that it speaks for and to the whole nation. And it needs to earn its mandate all the time. It can't rely on the fact that it's 98 years old and a much-loved institution. The comparisons with the NHS have some merit in them because people are fond of it, but it isn't the NHS, and it exists in a very febrile media environment where a whole generation of people have been brought up. They don't own televisions, and they get much of their content through YouTube or streaming services. So it has to earn a lot of permission if it's going to maintain its sort of status as a publicly funded public service broadcaster, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. I would love to hear anyone's views on the BBC coverage. I mean, we framed it, if you saw in the note that I sent out at the beginning of the week, we framed it, or I framed it at least, in the context of a bigger issue about the media, the extent to which we in journalism are looking back at who did or didn't do the right things in February and early March, and are we sufficiently looking forward at who's going to save this country or other countries from the consequences of an absolutely devastating economic recession, one that's going to play out very differently for different people. And of course, that's a different skill set, or a different set of contacts. One is about politics and parliament and relations in Westminster, or even understanding the institutional dynamics of the NHS. The other is trying to actually get under the lid of lots and lots of very small and very different businesses in different parts of the country, and how that affects people. It's much harder in that sense to gather information. And so I think it's a really big test of all newsrooms. Covering a recession, covering one like this is often something that finds newsrooms out. And so I think that's something that's on my mind. And the reason actually I wanted to see if I can I just bring in Claudia Williams? Claudia, are you there? Claudia's my colleague, and alongside Giles Whittell and Barney McIntyre, who's behind the scenes pulling the strings here this lunchtime. Claudia writes The Sense Maker. And Claudia, I just wondered, This is a really sort of harsh thing to do, but when you're looking at the coverage, not just the BBC but others too, and you're sort of marrying it against what you hear from people you know, what you see on social media, your own judgment, where do you think are the gaps in the way in which the media is covering it? Where do you see, if you like, the news and journalism congregating around the same stories? So how, you know, in your view, given that you're reading and looking at and filtering so much for SenseMaker, what's your judgment on how the news media is handling it?
That is a difficult question.
It is. I mean, time I've asked it and ducked it myself. I'm really quite pleased with that. Yeah.
My gut reaction is, I think in particular, stories like the care home crisis and prisons, they're the two things which immediately, as you asked me that question, that's what I thought about, because I think these are two areas which we've, especially, I know we've done it in the SenseMaker, we've brought them up, we've spoken about them, and then they seem to just get forgotten, and kind of, it was a topic for a day, and then suddenly now we're in this massive crisis with care homes where everyone's suddenly talking about it and realizing that this is actually the second epicenter of the entire crisis. So I think for me, and I think the same, if I was going to hedge a bet, I guess that's going to happen with prisons as well, where it's been brought up, it's been discussed, and it's been, you know, eclipsed by other concerns.
And what do you think, Claudia, what do you think about this point that newsrooms, one of the critiques of newsrooms, often I find the critiques of newsrooms miss some elements of them. One of them is the extent to which newsrooms are naturally drawn to covering other institutions. And so they can do sort of prison systems or the NHS or Parliament, but how you do, you know, someone who's got a small business, a hairdresser, and one that's more in depth than just a convenient case study is really hard. And given that this is hitting so many small businesses, it seems to me that's a really difficult thing to land. And I don't know whether or not you see anyone landing it well, or whether you think that is the element of the story that's being missed.
I think that is very, that's a fair assessment of what's happening. I know, especially in the SenseMaker, it's something that I find difficult all the time, because it's much easier to find and write a wealth story, for example, about Amazon than it is about, you know, a particular hairdresser in the north of England. That makes more sense. And then you do end up speaking about, say, these big institutions a lot more. I would say that, there are lots of different kind of news organizations I think are doing well, but I think actually this is where social media does very well, because a single thread on one person's story can be incredibly touching and engaging and also go viral. So that is where social media really does kind of hold its own. Obviously it brings problems of accuracy and fact checking and misinformation, which, you know, we're going to be talking about for the rest of this week. But I do think that is where social media, and particularly, I guess, journalists on social media, have been highlighting those kind of stories and, you know, following them up that way.
So Claudia, thanks. I'm going to try and bring a couple of other people, just to give people a sort of heads up. I'm going to, for about sort of the second half hour, I'd like to talk about the Tortoise news list, i.e. the stories we think are being undercovered. Anyone who's got additions, please, you know, write them in the text. I'll make sure that we pick them up too. I'm going to, if I may, ask Claire Montague just to fill in, because I think she makes a good point about the issues that the BBC faces. I don't know whether, Claire, are you there? And I do want to come to Ian Campbell as well, actually, just on Scotland, because I think that's always something, you know, we're at risk of missing.
Yeah, the point I was just making was that my sense is the BBC has become increasingly less relevant for younger audiences, and that this is a sort of structural and underlying problem. That's not to say that there isn't great content that is provided and consumed by younger audiences, like Peaky Blinders, like Killing Eve. But my understanding is that for a long time, this is something that has been of concern. And if you've got a generation that is not consuming the BBC, a pandemic, albeit with fantastic news coverage, which is the BBC's specialism, is not fundamentally changing a BBC's generational problem.
Yeah.
But presumably is going to be stacking up for the future, because pandemic will eventually pass and you're still consuming media in a different way. And your underlying problem of a generation not buying into content makes, I think, a compulsory funding structure really problematic.
Can I ask you, Claire, first, it's very nice to see you. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Good, okay, that's very good to hear. So tomorrow's piece that Basher Cummings has been editing and Pete Hoskins has been editing the other one is actually about Downing Street and the media, and given that you know a fair thing or two about that interplay between politics, political decision making, and the press coverage, the argument that runs through tomorrow's piece, without giving the game away, is really to say, look, we are witnessing a national catastrophe. The UK's performance in this area is distinctly different and in many ways worse than most countries in the rest of the world. And we are set to be the country that has the largest number of fatalities as things currently stand in Europe. Are we communicating what we've done right and what we've done wrong candidly enough? Are we treating the public like grown-ups? And are we looking ahead at the second wave of issues, whether they are social and mental health or economic and jobs? And it's about the sort of the candor and maturity of that comms operation and that strategy operation out of government, but equally the sort of the rigor of the questioning that it's getting from the media. I know that you weren't sort of frontline of that at the Home Office, but you obviously spent a fair amount of time living with it. What do you think?
Oh gosh, I mean, my sense is I find it really difficult because I'm also a punter on the front line, because my day job is I now run a hospice.
Oh yes, of course you do.
When I think about consuming news media and briefing from Downing Street, I think this is just utter bollocks, and they're not being honest. And the lived experience of those of us on the front line is very different from what is being said. So God knows how it feels if you're not on the front line and you're not in government and you're just a fairly scared member of the public. But I do also remember, I also have some compassion, even though I'm not of this government, for the decision making within government, which was always, even in my day, a complete nightmare. And I can only imagine how complex the set of swift decisions that are still being made on a daily basis between institutions across government, that I think also mitigates against proper, clear communication. And it doesn't help when you're on the receiving end of it, but particularly within the health infrastructure, the government reforms have made decision-making even more fragmented, with different agencies responsible for different parts of the health system. And then you overlay Whitehall, and then you overlay politics, and then you overlay different types of advice coming from different groups, whether it be scientists or business or whoever. And my guess would be is that actually trying to come to a coherent government decision between all those competing interests is almost being done in a contemporaneous way, and that probably gets in the way of some of the clarity and the being able to be considered and teaching, talking to people like they're grown-ups. So I have some compassion for the absolute horror of what government decision making must be like at the moment, and how you then try and communicate well and effectively out of that.
And Claire, so you mentioned the hospice situation. It would be crazy for you to mention it and not to get a sense of. So what are you seeing there? Presumably, you're not seeing COVID-related deaths in the hospice, or
yeah, we are. Yeah, we are seeing COVID-related deaths. So we're seeing a number of things. Will
you just tell us a little bit about it, like how many people it is, where it is, etc.
So I ran a hospice in South London, Royal Trinity Hospice, and Chief Operating Officer there. And we normally look after people with a life-limiting condition, so classically cancer, but also motor neuron disease or dementia or whatever. And we're looking after people who either are our normal patient group, who have had COVID or who have COVID, or we are also looking after patients who wouldn't normally be in our patient group. So they have probably underlying health conditions, but not ones which are inherently life-limiting. but where they have decided that they don't want to be ventilated, they've got an agreed advanced care plan with their community, with their GP, and they're coming in to us to be looked after, to be palliated, rather than going into a hospital environment.
And so have you got the rise, have you got an increase in numbers then?
Yes, in both beds and also in the community. So the vast majority of the care that we give is to people in their own homes, and the support, we've had an increase in support, particularly in the community, people coming to us for advice and support for COVID. And in the beds is a fixed number of beds, so we have as many people come in, and either they are have an infection or they don't. But the issue for us is PPE, like everywhere else.
Is it?
And also the kind of ludicrousness of the testing regime.
Yeah, and do you think, from where you sit, it was really striking? Kerry Thomas and Dave Taylor did a podcast the week before last on just interviewing a vicar, and it was a vicar in South Wales, who, I think South Wales, but certainly Wales, who had typically would see 4 to 6, I think it was, funerals every fortnight. She'd seen 14, of which only 4 were COVID, but 4 were suicides. And it made me think, how much is there a wave of suffering or death that is a knock-on of COVID? Are you seeing any of that in terms of hospice care, people choosing not to go to hospital that otherwise would have done?
Only in a sort of considered way with people who are already pretty sick at the moment. I think one of the big things that we are very worried about is about grief and bereavement. So one of the things that we're doing, like very many other providers, is we have to limit visitors into our beds. And also when we're looking after, so unless someone is imminently dying, they won't have visitors coming in with them. And that's a real difficulty for our staff and for patients, whereas normally we are a bustling unit with people coming in 24/7.
Yeah.
We don't have visiting hours, people move in, bring their dogs, and that's part of how we care. And it's also part of how people come to terms with death afterwards.
Yeah.
And obviously with people who are dying in the community, they may well be dying in self-isolation, with families not able to be present, or families who themselves are self-isolating. So I think there is going to be a significant issue about grief and bereavement, because people are dying now and not being cared for and grieving in ways that you would normally, they can't observe the normal rituals. And that, whether that's true of funerals where only 4 or 5 people can be present, or deaths where people may or may not be able to be present, whether that's in hospital or in the community, I think grief and bereavement is going to be a real problem.
All right, Claire. Well, thank you. That's incredibly helpful. We should think about that. In fact, it's sort of the nature of what we're trying to do here on Tuesdays. It's been funny in the last week or so. I think certainly I felt not just a gathering sort of personal kind of wave of distress about all of these things, but a concern that people are covering things in the same way, and that we're not giving ourselves room, not in a kind of blame game kind of way, but in a way that interrogates the situation we find ourselves in, to be able to ask, what are we getting wrong, and what are the consequences of that? And with that in mind, what we decided to do was try to pull together this news list. It's exactly that kind of thing, Claire, that we're trying to do, exactly what you just discussed, to say, actually, what's the nature of grief and bereavement? How is it affected, and what can, if anything, be done about it, that we're trying to get at with the news list. I'm going to come to Kerry, because we had a conversation about one of the issues. We're trying to understand what's happening. As you know, at Tortoise, we've done a lot of reporting. Polly Curtis, my colleague, has done a lot of reporting, in particular around family separation and the way in which the state intervenes on the family. It's prompted a discussion about how that might work, specifically in an age of Zoom and digital courtrooms or digital legal systems. And Kerry Thomas, I think, Kerry, if you're still there, you know, do you want to just talk a little bit about how we're beginning to think about this more broadly, rather than just in the family separation context?
So I think, just to go back to before this crisis, I've got a friend who's a judge, and before COVID, I was talking to her. She's a Crown Court judge, and she was seeing cases of. She talked to me particularly about one case of a young man who was 22, who just come before her in a court in central London, having committed a crime when he was 19. He waited 3 years, and obviously that's terrible for victims of justice. But is equally terrible. It's also terrible for young people whose life is effectively on hold from 19 to 22 while they find out which way the case is going to go. So that was the situation before all this, and those delays that were terrible then are going to be an absolute mountain by the time we come out the other side of this. And certainly the expectation, I think, in the judiciary is that remote justice is likely to be part of a sort of quick and dirty solution to getting through that mountain of cases as quickly as people can. And that worries people for a couple of reasons. One of which is that obviously the criminal justice system has used video links to do a certain amount of things. Remand hearings done by video link from prisons, those kind of things have been going on for a while. But actually they've been doing more and more by video link rather than in person. And I think there's evidence to show that the people who are from poorer backgrounds, people who are less well educated, do come out less well when they're treated by video link than they do in person. So there's a suggestion that it can bake in disadvantages that are already at play in the system. And then beyond that, something we don't talk about a lot, which is the sort of idea of the majesty, the authority, the importance of that sort of authority of your justice system, and what it does to that sense of the importance of it if you reduce it to a Zoom call. I went to last year I went to a sentencing, and I was amazed that it was a serious crime. The person ended up getting 8 years, and that was done by a slightly scratchy video link from the sentencing was done down a video link from a prison. I had expected that something that had that kind of weight and moment would have been done in person, but it wasn't. So I think this whole question of whether we are going to move to remote justice to get through the backlog, and what the long tail of that will be in the way that the criminal justice system is thought about, and the effect that it has on disproportionately on different parts of society will be it's just a really big question for us to get into.
Right. Well, Kerry, thank you. I see Don Tyler saying, how are we going to handle this news list? And like so many things at Tortoise, we're working it out as we go along. So what we decided this week was I would talk through what we thought was on the Tortoise news list. We would then hear what others thought should be on it, and we would then publish it on the back of that. It might be better in the future to publish it on the morning of our open news meeting, and then take it from, and then allow people to discuss it. But just to give you a sense of, here are a number of the stories that we think are really worth looking into. So one is aid money. We had David Miliband on a Think-In last night, and we had Ruth Davidson, the week before, both of them pointing out an extraordinary thing which seems to us not really to have registered, that the better part of £1 billion, £780 million has come out of the UK to go to the aid effort around COVID-19, but it's all gone from governments to intergovernment institutions, from the likes of the UK government to the UN. A tiny proportion, when Ruth looked into it, it was 20 million out of 780 million had gone to NGOs. When David Miliband was on the line last night, he was saying, look, we're getting no money at the International Rescue Committee for help for our programs. They need about £30 million. None of it's coming through the UN. It's all coming out of private donors. This is a colossal problem if you think that there is a second wave of humanitarian crisis coming, particularly in the developing world. There's a second question, which is, in the UK, the largest single commitment under the rubric of quote unquote, whatever it takes to sustain the economy that Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, made was to back something called CBILS, the Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan Scheme. But so far, just over 1% of the £330 billion of government backed funding that's available has gone out the door to businesses. So 20,000+ businesses have got funding, 50,000+ have applied, and more than half didn't get it. But the reality is that tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of businesses are really in trouble, and it's particularly the small ones. So why is this not working? Is it the Treasury? Is it the British Business Bank? Is it the banking system? What's stopping support? A big question, should we be looking at what's going to happen to the way people finance things offshore and the way individuals conduct their finances offshore? Because surely what we're seeing is there's no such thing as offshore. People and their businesses all operate in countries. And as you can see, companies that are trying to get funding, government funding, when they're operating offshore, have been met with pretty short shrift by the public. And there are a number of others that we've got on the list. The one that Kerry just touched upon, justice delayed, remote justice, and we're really, really interested in thinking and looking more specifically at the WHO. That's not, if you like, an unreported story, but perhaps a misunderstood one. So those are the kinds of things that we're interested in. I see, for example, in the chat that we've, and Don, just to make your point, we'll make sure that we publish it and people can comment on it and hopefully add and make suggestions. But I wanted to give an ask, if I can, to Andrew Brown, who's joined us, because one of the things we want to do is see if we can look directly at some of the, the sort of the key elements of the government's response to COVID. And one, of course, right now is about testing and contact tracing and the way that, I'm wondering whether Andrew Brown's there. Is he, Andrew?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Andrew,
yeah.
Why don't you weigh in and just sort of say what you think of the government's or the proposed system under this official new app?
Well, it's the app itself that is the problem, as I understand it, because they've decided to do it alone. They want something that works the way the government thinks these apps ought to work. Unfortunately, this clashes with the idea that Apple and Google think the way the apps ought to work. And this is going to lead to a very bad situation because there is this deep distrust of government in Silicon Valley, and I mean, I think profoundly hypocritical in some respects, but Apple and Google have come up with this API, to use the technical term, which will allow phones to work for tracing, but in a completely decentralized way. They have deliberately written it so that no government can collect centrally the information that the phones are collecting. And the NHS, for obvious reasons, wants to get at these statistics. So it has written an app which will enable you to do this, but because of the Apple-Google technique, it will only work, the Bluetooth tracing will only work if this app is on, and if it's on your phone and if you're actually running it. It won't work in the background. This has been absolutely made impossible by Apple. They won't do Bluetooth probings in the background. So first, you've got an app which needs people to download it. And we don't know if they're going to do that. In Singapore, the download rate was only about 20%. And then having been downloaded, they need to keep the thing running all the time. And we can be almost certain that they won't do that. It's going to chew up battery. It's going to get in the way of other things they want to do with their phones. So it's just not going to work, even though and a huge amount of effort has obviously gone into it and a huge amount of thought. I don't think the idea of a centralized NHS database for this is in itself unreasonable. But because it runs contrary to the reigning ideology in Silicon Valley, it's unworkable. And we're banging our heads against the wall here.
And this is, you think, if you like, a sort of a wish to believe on the part of government that technology can act, and an excess confidence on the part of Silicon Valley. The reason I'm just pausing, Andrew, is that I think there's a really interesting issue here. You know, I was speaking to someone the other day at Apple, and I was saying, it's a really interesting moment here that Apple, a company that has been so reluctant to see itself as powerful as we see it, In fact, he was saying, I think that Tim Cook had once said the last thing we would ever want would for Apple to be seen as a kind of great sovereign state. And actually,
but they are.
in many ways they are. You know, we did that series at the beginning of the year, starting with Apple as one of the tech nations. But the interesting thing is, to give them their due, Andrew, what they are doing is stepping in at an incredibly difficult moment and taking more responsibility than they normally would for a public policy problem rather than a private consumer offer. And so they are actually stepping up to try and do something that's difficult, for which they're no doubt going to find themselves getting roundly, at best commented on, but most likely criticised.
Yes, they are. The underlying point is that they're stepping up to solve this public policy problem, and their solution takes precedence over anything that a democratically elected government might decide. If our government decided it wanted to have a different kind of what is, after all, a public policy problem, should we have a centralized database, it can't. Because the Apple and Google have decided that technologically that's not going to work.
All right, but Andrew, thank you. I'm going to sort of wheel round, if I might, and just go back to the thing that Claire raised about grief and bereavement, just because there's so many people making comments as you were speaking, Andrew, on that subject, and I think it suggests that, you know, we should really think about how we would follow it up. I saw Ben Whitelaw was saying, you know, who's really looked at that. I see that, you know, my co-founder Katie had the sad and terrible news that her mother-in-law, Nick's mother, has died this morning. And I see Zav, and Katie, obviously, if you want to speak, you know how to, but if you don't want to, I think everyone totally understands. But I also see my colleague Zav Greenwood. Zav, can I get you to tell us a little bit more about this? Because I know that people are really struggling with this idea of family not being able to come to hospitals, not being able to come to hospices. And I'm struck by the idea that actually it's nurses who are saying it would be valuable for families to be able to come and do exactly that. Can I bring you in? Are you there?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so the ICU nurse I was talking to was one of the, so for people who didn't know, we did an Unheard Voices thinking last week, out of which we're kind of producing a story for the end of this month. And this ICU nurse is a nurse in Blackburn. And I was just kind of doing a follow-up interview with her and was asking her, you know, about what, you know, emotional support they were getting as hospital workers, and then specifically what part of the job she was finding very difficult. And, you know, for their hospital in Blackburn, they haven't had the surge of COVID cases that they expected. So they've not had a kind of hospital that's been overwhelmed. And so that side has been kind of okay for her. But for her, what she's found really hard is, you know, as a nurse, she's very used to kind of dealing with death. And, you know, her job previously has been to, you know, call up families and say, you know, your kind of father or your mother has passed away. But what she'd said to me was, you know, in the past, however awful the experience of death has been for these families, what I've always felt I'm able to do is, you know, provide, you know, dignity, you know, for these people who are going through this process. And often, you know, that's allowing relatives to come into hospital and say their goodbyes, and, you know, feeling like the relatives have, can kind of start that grieving process there, I suppose. And then obviously for the patient who's dying, give them some comfort when they pass away.
Yeah.
And what she's finding really difficult emotionally, and what people in the hospital are finding difficult emotionally, is the fact that they can't provide that. And her argument, at least, was, look, we already make allowances for social distancing on funerals by saying, you know, you're allowed up to 5 people, up to 10 people, depending on where you are. She thinks, at least in her hospital, they can provide the correct PPE for people to come in, for relatives to come in. And so she would like to see that. And it's worth saying as well that this is all hospital patients. You know, if you're dying of a heart attack in hospital in Blackburn, you can't have your relatives come in because of the risk of infection. So it's affecting everyone who's in the hospital.
Yeah, and especially people who've lived with an illness for a very, very long time. That is incredibly difficult. I can imagine. Zav, it's very nice to see you. Just to let you know that when I was at the BBC, I think Kerry must have had the same thing. We had so many struggles trying to figure out how to either blur someone's face or silhouette them in order to protect their identity. Strangely enough, the way you're sitting with the sun coming in through the window meant that you've done it perfectly, almost accidentally, but that's my colleague Zav Greenwood protecting his identity. It feels odd and strange not to do what we would do if we were in our newsroom, and given the news that Katie's had and the willingness that she's had to sort of talk about it and share it, just say invite her to join us, not least of course Katie, because Nick, Katie's husband, is part of the founding family of Tortoise. It was our first sort of away day was in their garden in Sussex, and it was Nick who probably set us on the path to doing the things we're doing. So, Katie, do you want to just sort of tell us a little bit about what happened to Nick and the rest of his family in the loss of his mother-in-law?
So Margaret, so my mother-in-law Margaret was in her early 90s. She had quite advanced dementia, so she was in a care home. And so the difficult thing is that she's not seen anyone for the last 6 weeks. I think the hard thing, to Claire's point about what's being sort of the grief that's being built up, is that when they found out yesterday that they said that she had sort of was almost giving up. So they don't know if it was COVID related. She was tested for COVID. It came back negative. The care home still think it might have been COVID related and one of the false negatives. But anyway, she just sort of gave up and had taken to her bed. And then they did give them the chance to go in, although they couldn't go in altogether, obviously. And they weren't sure if they had the right PPE, but they were given the opportunity. And because of her advanced dementia, I think everyone in the family, you know, she wasn't conscious, and they took that difficult call not to go in. And so to Claire's point about some of the stuff that's building up, I think we've got the situation where, you know, you've not been able to see a relative for 6 weeks because of the isolation, and she's in a care home. And then you're given sort of a Hobson's choice in many ways, which is you can't go in together. And if you do go in, you might not have the right PPE. So they didn't.
Kate, thank you. I'm sorry. Please send love to Nick. That is just
I will.
Great, poor man. I want to actually just ask Kerry about this, because Kerry, I mean, I wonder, it's interesting how many people are talking about this, how they're worrying about it. I was really, really struck in the podcast the week before last, sorry, with the vicar. You know, this terrible example of one person whose mother had died but chose not to go to the funeral so some of the grandkids could go. I don't know what you think about this, whether or not there is something really sort of long-term damaging about the way in which people are experiencing grief and bereavement.
It's fascinating. I mean, I think so. For those who didn't hear the podcast, what the vicar said to us, she was finding it incredibly hard herself, because, as Claire was saying, not just the participants in the funerals, but the people who are carrying them out rely on the rituals to give them meaning and get them through. And so she said how in the first week of doing funerals where there were limited numbers of people there. She's in a part of Cardiff where they used to very big funerals, and they couldn't have big funerals. That she was limited to 10, which is actually, I think, more than you can have in some parts of the country. She was finding herself breaking down in tears in the car directly after all the funerals that she'd done, because they weren't normal, because they were just much more upsetting than normal. So she's a kind of an indication of how someone who's not used to being upset by a funeral was being, and then how much worse for people who are not in her position of having a kind of set of rituals that help them get through these things. So I think I couldn't agree more. I think there will be this reservoir of grief that will underlie all this. And people, I think, have been making a point in the chat as well about, we hear this from nurses as well, that the hardest thing they find is just the lack of physical contact, the lack of being able just to sort of physically console people, each other, patients, families. The vicar said that too. So I think it feels like an important big sort of scene that we could get into.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Kerry. Tess, Murray.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi there.
Hi. It was just a quick one. It was just sort of widening out on that point. I completely agree with the sort of delayed collective grief in both practitioners and patients and families, and it's heartbreaking. I just often thought though that, we have the National Childbirth Trust, which is huge, and and I spent more time preparing for a birth that never worked out the way it was supposed to than I've ever thought about my own death. And I just wonder if, I now actually I've talked to my children a lot about death, and we've had to confront it in a way we've never had to confront it, sort of in a way as a society, and whether something will come out of it that allows us to talk about it and express our feelings about it, instead of that, just don't go there, we're not talking about it, and that will lead us to have more open conversations. And perhaps we need some sort of system to make sure that we prepare for death as well as we prepare for birth. It's just the thought, we don't have anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, Katie's just made this point that the emotional price of COVID-19 is as important as the economic one, and it's such a difficult thing because, it was interesting when we held one of the early thinkings about what does God think of the coronavirus, right? How do we respond to it spiritually, emotionally? It was really clear that we journalists really struggle with, I was going to say, that seam of life, the most important seam of life, and we're particularly bad at it when it's chronic rather than acute, i.e. it's not a crisis, it's something that has just fundamentally changed our internal weather, but we really shy away from, and rightly and understandably shy away from, describing feelings that we can't pretend to know. But I don't know, I think we're going to have to come back and think about how we do it, and perhaps there's no better way than actually doing what we've done in this conversation, which is describing the stories of people who experience it, and then leave it for us or our members to try and think their way into, to imagine their way into that experience emotionally. I know that Mehdi had his hand up ages ago. I don't know whether, Mehdi, your point is completely unrelated about it, but I'm just going to come to Carly, if I may, because Carly has pointed to a video about talking about death. It just picks up on your point, Tess. Carly, because it's just come up here, I haven't seen it, but I'm just interested to know, this when I was at the Times was a big subject, moving away from the dignity of death, the sanctity of life arguments that refuse to talk about death, to the dignity in death arguments. Carly, you there? I'm just going to...
Yep, I'm here. I was just doing my ironing, so I've just sat down. I'm a medical student. I'm doing a graduate programme in Scotland that's trying to be quite innovative and teach us all how to sort of involve patients a lot more, which was a really big project of the former CMO, Catherine Calderwood's Realistic Medicine project. And the video that I linked, it's by, I think she's called Catherine Mannix. I haven't watched this for months, but we were asked to watch it for our course that week for a case, and I think she's got a book, and it's just about explaining to someone what will happen with death, and exactly as Tessa said, like when you're telling someone about any form of treatment, you go into exact detail about what's going to happen, but you don't prepare people for death, and you don't prepare the family for what will happen, and people being really anxious about feeding people when they're dying, which actually is kind of, from my understanding, almost counterintuitive towards the end, because it takes such a lot of energy to metabolize that food, and actually our natural instincts aren't correct, and we need to recognize that and teach each other, you know, what's happening for families as much as those that are at the end of their life, I think.
Carly, thank you. I'm gonna just come, if I may, at the end, just to Louise Simpson. Louise, the reason I'd like to come to you is that, you know, I think lots of people are worried about how they manage each other's feelings and their families' feelings through all of this. And I see here that you said that your father died. I'm so sorry, and that you held his funeral on Zoom, and it meant that people from all over the world were able to be there. Louise, can you tell us anything about it? And I understand if you'd rather not talk about it, but there you are.
It was extraordinary. I mean, we planned it because Zoom existed, and if we hadn't had Zoom, how grim it would have been to all be separate. None of his children were there. My mother died ages ago, so his funeral would have been a really bleak moment without us. But somehow Zoom, I know it wasn't real, but it felt real. I spoke over the grave. My sister spoke over the grave. We do know the cemetery, but I really felt it was real because it was in real time. How bad would it have felt to be sitting alone, as me and my siblings all were in our different parts of the world, imagining what would have been happening when it was happening. It was extraordinary.
And Louise, and so where was your father buried?
Up in Scotland.
And where are you?
Versailles.
And your other siblings?
One in India, one in Somerset, and one in the south of France.
My goodness. So everyone was all out. Sorry, Louise.
Yeah, we were all because it was all in Scotland. The lockdown for homes actually did happen, I think, earlier than England, and none of us saw him in the last 6 weeks. We were in communication with him. I learned afterwards that my brother had a visual moment with him. I was texting him, and yes, and we heard the sort of call that would have no doubt in the olden days would have been "you need to come now" moment, and of course none of us could come, and then he died, and then, you know, within a week we set up Zoom, and it was extraordinary. There were friends of his that were there who would have been too old to travel in normal times, who are really grateful that we did it, and it's thanks to Zoom.
Oh, that's amazing. And also, by the way, given that we have at Tortoise a fair bit of experience of dealing with Zoom and all its good things and bad things, actually it's really thanks to you, because the truth is managing that, I'm sure, between the family, between the technology, and making it work for everyone is an amazing thing to have achieved, even in such sad circumstances. So sorry from all of us, and thank you for talking about it and giving us a think about the way forward. Listen, I realise that our hour is up. I just wanted to say that, you know, this has been an incredibly useful open news meeting in exactly the spirit that we most want it to be. I hope that we've sort of showed you a little bit under the bonnet of the stories that we've been working on. We've talked a little bit about the news list. I think probably we're right next week to run the news list in advance and give people the room to weigh in on it. We'll certainly give that a try. But most valuably, you know, they're two really big ideas. You know, the point that Andrew Brown made about the app, and I've seen this kind of slew of comments about who do you trust more on privacy? Is it the government or is it the tech giants? Are these apps, is this data going to be interoperable? In which case, well, that's a big step and a big change. Or is everyone going to be operating in their silos? In which case, it's not going to be very effective. But of course, perhaps most importantly and most sort of movingly, has been this question of how do we think about grief and bereavement, as prompted by Claire Montague. Claire, thank you for opening that conversation and making us think about it. By next week, I hope we'll have wrapped our heads around how we would best respond to it and capture it. Certainly one thing that we've been doing, and I just encourage everyone to do, is try to capture the very kind of human, individual experience of this. I know we're all, in theory, experiencing the same thing, but we're actually doing it so separately and differently. And our series of letters from lockdown has been a way of capturing individually, this is what it's like. And I hope that if you are on and part of our thinking today and you think, actually, you know what, I'd like to write 800 to 1,000 words. I'd like to record this particular moment in lockdown or what it's prompted me to think. We'd love to hear from you. We're publishing them both from people we've tapped on the shoulder, but from our members that have written in. It's been an amazing way of capturing this moment. I think it will end up being something like a book, a long listen. Please do weigh in. It would be wonderful to have you as a part of it. But for now, thank you very much. And believe it or not, we do have a think-in at 6:30 this evening, which is about how we're going to innovate our way out of this and the redesign of capitalism, no less. We should probably get that done in 45 minutes and have 15 minutes to spare. Have a very good afternoon, or wherever you are in the world, a good rest of your day. Thanks so much. Bye.